The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of the public park, casting long, dappled shadows across the emerald grass. Kelly Anderson stood near the perimeter path, her hands tightly clutching her handbag as her eyes remained fixed on a lone figure seated on a park bench a short distance away. Beside her, Betty, a trusted friend whose calm demeanor usually provided a steady anchor, placed a gentle, reassuring hand on Kelly's shoulder. Kelly's breath came in quick, nervous hitches as she made a movement to step forward, only for Betty to catch her arm with a soft, pleading smile. Betty urged her to slow down, gently holding her back from making a sudden dash across the lawn. She asked Kelly what she had honestly intended to do, asking if she was really going to walk right up to the woman and announce herself as the baby given up for adoption 20 years ago. Kelly paused, letting out a long sigh as she admitted that the overwhelming anxiety of the moment had almost driven her to act recklessly just to get the ordeal over with before her courage evaporated completely. Betty nodded with deep empathy, acknowledging that she understood the emotional weight of the moment entirely. However, Betty reminded her that they had not even spoken to the lady yet and were not even entirely positive that she was the correct person. Even if the identity proved true, Betty maintained that it would be far better for her to approach the woman alone first to ensure the lady was truly willing and ready for such a reunion. Kelly swallowed her hesitation, looked at her friend with quiet trust, and agreed to let Betty handle the initial contact, asking only that she not take too long. Betty promised to do her very best and turned toward the park path. Meanwhile, in a quiet office across town, Private Investigator Barnaby Jones sat behind his neatly organized wooden desk, listening attentively to Kelly Anderson, who had come to seek his guidance following a tragic turn of events. Barnaby expressed his sincere commitment to pick up the investigation right where his late colleague, Marvin Gates, had been forced to leave off, though he admitted he truly wished Marvin were still alive to see the case through to its completion. Kelly looked down at her hands, sharing that after the terrible accident occurred, she had seriously considered abandoning the search altogether. However, Marvin's widow had thoughtfully called her and suggested she reach out to Barnaby. Barnaby leaned forward slightly, asking Miss Anderson to clarify exactly what Marvin had been investigating on her behalf. Kelly explained simply that Marvin was trying to help her locate someone exceptionally important to her, namely her birth mother. Barnaby gently probed further, noting that he seemed to recall reading in the news that her mother and father had tragically perished in an aviation crash years prior. Kelly softly clarified that those wonderful people were her adoptive parents, not her biological parents. Barnaby expressed his deep sympathy for her loss and admitted he had not realized the circumstances. Kelly explained that she herself had been entirely unaware of the adoption until her parents' estate attorney presented her with a sealed letter that had been left alongside their last will and testament. Barnaby observed that such a revelation must have come as quite a profound shock. Kelly nodded, reflecting on how her adoptive parents wrote in the letter that while they did not know the identity of her biological father, they had preserved a document containing her mother's name. She handed a paper across the desk to Barnaby, identifying the name on it as Mary Renee Wilson. Barnaby examined the document and noted that it was a photocopy, inquiring whether Kelly possessed the original. Kelly replied that she did not, admitting she liked to cherish the quiet hope that her real mother had kept the original document for herself as a cherished keepsake to remember the child she had been forced to give up so long ago. Barnaby smiled warmly, agreeing that such a thought was entirely logical and that he could easily believe that was precisely how things had transpired. Looking at the paper, Kelly pointed out that according to the record, her mother had been exceedingly young, merely 17 years old, when Kelly was born. She shared a reflective thought, expressing how strange it was that finding out about the adoption had not felt like a total surprise. In truth, she suspected she had quietly sensed it ever since she was a little girl. Even though her adoptive parents had done absolutely everything in their power to make her feel cherished as their own child. Barnaby assured her that he would give her an update the very instant he uncovered any tangible information. However, he gently posed a thought to her, asking if she was entirely certain she wanted to dig into the distant past after 20 whole years had passed. Kelly admitted with total candor that while she was not completely sure she wanted to open those old doors, she felt an unmistakable inner calling that she simply had to try. In a cluttered, dimly lit apartment on the other side of the city, a man named Grant Brockman tossed an empty aluminum beverage container into a trash bin. He turned to a woman named Anita, complaining that it had taken him the entire night to dispose of the automobile and secure a ride back into town. He asked if there was any more beer left in the kitchen, but Anita shook her head, informing him that he had just finished the very last one. She gestured toward a morning newspaper resting on the counter, pointing out a brief article regarding the private detective who had met with a sudden end. She looked at Grant with a mix of anxiety and frustration, asking if it had really been necessary to kill the man. Grant defended his actions harshly, pointing out that the investigator was on the verge of delivering the young heiress directly into Anita's sister's lap. Anita expressed surprise that the detective had managed to get that remarkably close to the truth. Grant reminded her that she had inadvertently blabbed far too much information during her initial conversation with the man. Anita protested that her slip-up had occurred before they had devised their current plan, explaining that when the detective originally showed up at her door inquiring about her sister Mary, she had no idea what the grander situation entailed. Grant dismissed her defense, stating firmly that their plan never would have succeeded with that investigator freely roaming around anyway. He reassured her that no one would ever discover the detective had visited them first, and as far as the young girl was concerned, she remained completely ignorant of what her birth mother even looked like. Grant then pressed Anita, asking if she had contacted Mary yet. When Anita hesitated, Grant reminded her sharply that handling Mary was her explicit responsibility in their joint venture. Anita sighed, reminding Grant that she and her sister had not spoken a single word to one another in 8 long years. Grant retorted that he did not care if 80 years had elapsed, pointing out that the young girl had recently inherited a massive fortune worth several $1,000,000 and was actively searching for her mother. Reluctantly, Anita agreed to make the call as soon as she finished laundry, but Grant cut her off with a calculated grin. He announced a far better idea, suggesting he go wash up so that the two of them could travel together to see Mary face to face. Over at the police headquarters, Barnaby Jones met with a police lieutenant to review the personal belongings recovered from the late investigator Marvin Gates. The lieutenant placed a small plastic bag on the desk containing a single wallet, one pocket notebook, an assortment of keys, and some loose pocket change. Barnaby asked if the police had managed to look into the background of Mary Renee Wilson. The lieutenant confirmed that while there was an old record under that name, the modern central computer system had returned no active hits. Barnaby flipped through the photocopied pages of Marvin's notebook, pointing out a series of numerical entries and asking if they meant anything specific to the police. The lieutenant shrugged, replying that it appeared to be nothing more than basic vehicle mileage and minor travel expenses. Barnaby suggested that Marvin's secretary, Emily Cage, might be able to derive some clearer meaning from the notations, and he requested permission to take copies of the final pages. The lieutenant readily agreed, updating Barnaby on the hit-and-run investigation by stating that witnesses had merely identified the vehicle as a dark four-door sedan from the early 1970s, though no one had managed to capture a vehicle make or license plate number. The lieutenant informed Barnaby that official copies would be ready at the duty desk within 10 minutes. Shortly thereafter, Grant Brockman and Anita arrived at a modest, secluded home nestled in a quiet canyon area. As they stepped out of their vehicle, Grant adjusted his jacket, admitting nervously to Anita that he felt as though he might mess up the plan, anticipating that Mary would simply tell him to get lost. He joked lightheartedly about his past career as a reasonably skilled used car salesman, proposing that they test whether he could successfully pitch a long-lost sister. Approaching the front porch, Grant knocked gently on the door. A woman with a gentle, weathered face opened the door, cautiousness written in her eyes. She looked at the man and asked who he was. Grant introduced himself smoothly as Grant Brockman, explaining that he was a close friend of her sister, Anita. Upon hearing her sister's name, Mary's posture stiffened slightly. Grant quickly acknowledged that he was fully aware Mary and Anita had shared significant differences and hardships over the course of many years. Mary remarked coolly that describing their past as merely having differences was putting the matter far too mildly. Grant nodded sympathetically, explaining that what Mary might not realize was how deeply Anita blamed herself for the painful rift that had grown between them. He assured her that Anita wanted nothing more in the world than to make amends and reconcile. He then gestured toward the car parked near the driveway, revealing that Anita was sitting right inside the vehicle at that very moment. Mary looked toward the car in genuine disbelief, astonished that Anita had traveled all the way there to seek forgiveness. Grant explained that Anita had lacked the courage to walk up to the front door herself, losing her nerve at the final second. Mary looked at Grant thoughtfully, asking why he was taking such a deep, personal interest in bringing about a reconciliation between two estranged sisters. Grant offered a warm, candid smile, explaining that the answer was remarkably simple. He intended to marry Anita, but she carried a constant emotional cloud over her heart due to the unresolved, painful history with her sister. He pointed out that Anita had summoned the courage to travel all this way, which had required immense emotional effort, and he asked Mary if she could find enough forgiveness in her heart to meet her sister halfway. Touched by his earnest appeal, Mary stepped onto the porch and walked toward the car. As Anita stepped out, the two sisters stood facing each other after nearly a decade of silence. Anita observed softly that Mary was looking remarkably well, and Mary returned the compliment with a gentle smile. Pausing in the emotional silence, Anita admitted with light humor that she could not think of a single sensible thing to say after all this time. Mary chuckled softly, noting that it was rather silly for them to stand outside on the gravel, and cordially invited Anita and Mr. Brockman inside for a visit. Back at Marvin Gates' detective agency, Barnaby Jones sat down with Marvin's secretary, Emily Cage, to review the ongoing matters of the office. Emily gestured to a stack of paperwork, remarking with affectionate weariness that some of the files had been sitting in Marvin's desk since before she first met him, joking that one would think he might throw items away once in a while. She expressed uncertainty regarding how to handle the Anderson case, noting that Marvin had been actively working on it for almost 10 full days prior to his untimely passing. Barnaby gently put her mind at ease, explaining that he had already taken full responsibility for that matter and had instructed Kelly Anderson to send the entire investigation fee directly to Emily. Emily protested politely, but Barnaby insisted, reminding her of the long-standing professional gentleman's agreement among private investigators that when one colleague takes over another's active workload, the compensation goes to support the original office. He quipped with a grin that Marvin himself must have honored that tradition a dozen times, to which Emily smiled gratefully, admitting she would not pretend she could not use the financial support. Barnaby then produced the copied pages from Marvin's personal notebook and asked Emily to examine them for any subtle clues related to Kelly's mother. Emily scanned the entries, noting that most items were routine operational expenses, logged hours, and vehicle mileage. However, she paused at a specific notation containing the capital letters E and D. Barnaby pondered if those letters represented an abbreviation or a specific first name such as Ed. Emily instantly recalled that Marvin had mentioned a man named Ed Flynn, whom he described as a dedicated forest ranger who had been exceptionally helpful during his preliminary inquiries. When Barnaby asked if Marvin had mentioned where Ranger Flynn was stationed, Emily admitted she could not recall offhand. Thinking quickly,